The richest man in America died in 1877. Within 50 years, his entire fortune was gone. Not stolen, not lost in a crash. Simply gone, because the generation that inherited the wealth never inherited the knowledge to keep it. That is not a Vanderbilt problem. That is a structural problem, one that repeats silently across every generation, in every country, in every economy. The school system you sat in for 12 years taught you history, geography, and literature. It never taught you how money actually works. That was not an accident. That was a design decision. And someone made it deliberately. Act T. Why? What people think is happening here is what most people believe. They believe that school teaches you what you need to know to survive in the world. That the curriculum was designed, however imperfectly, to prepare citizens for modern life. That if something as fundamental as money was left out of the curriculum, it was an oversight, a bureaucratic gap, the kind of thing that gets corrected eventually. Most people look at the absence of financial education in schools and call it a policy failure. We are not going to call it a policy failure. We are going to call it what the historical record suggests it is, a policy outcome. Only 16 states currently require a standalone personal finance course for high school graduation. In the wealthiest nation in recorded history, after more than 2 centuries of compulsory schooling, 16 states. Think about what that means. Most young adults are sent into a system built almost entirely around financial decisions. Mortgages, debt, compound interest, tax liability, investment allocation, with no formal instruction on how any of it works. That is not an accident. That is architecture. Act 2, where the architecture came from. Let's go back further. Before the mass education era, formal schooling was mostly reserved for the elite. The wealthy hired tutors. They sent their children to private academies. They taught them rhetoric, accounting, property law, and estate management. They taught them how money compounds, how debt enslaves, and how ownership, not employment, is the primary mechanism of wealth accumulation. Then came the Industrial Revolution, and with it, a problem. Factories needed workers, mines needed operators, railways needed clerks, conductors, and freight managers. The emerging industrial economy needed millions of human beings willing to show up at a specific time, follow instructions from a superior, tolerate repetitive work, and not ask questions about the ownership structure above them. As industrialization changed the way people worked, it created the need for universal schooling. Factory owners required agreeable workers who would show up on time and do what their managers told them. Sitting in a classroom all day with a teacher at the front was good training for that. This is not conspiracy theory. This is economic history. The modern education system was reverse engineered from a 19th century Prussian military obedience program and scaled by American industrialists to produce a compliant, functional workforce. The Prussian model prioritized rote memorization and compliance. Lessons were designed around repetition and absorption rather than critical thinking or problem solving. Individuality was discouraged. These traits were considered less valuable for the societal roles envisioned for most children: factory workers, soldiers, and orderly citizens. In 1843, Horace Mann traveled to Germany to study this model. Upon returning to the United States, he lobbied to have it adopted. By 1852, it was institutionalized in Massachusetts and spread outward from there like a structural blueprint. Now here's the part most people never examine. The Ford Foundation, the Rockefeller Foundation, and especially the Carnegie Foundation were among the key contributors that shaped the character of public schools and their curricula. The same men who built the great American fortunes of the 19th century, Carnegie, Rockefeller, Ford, were the primary private funders of the public education system. They shaped its curriculum. They endowed its departments. They defined what would and would not be taught in classrooms across the country. Andrew Carnegie needed competent workers to keep his steel machine churning. He needed mine operators, furnace workers, machine repairmen, safety engineers. He endowed libraries, built institutions, and shaped teaching grants that defined the national curriculum. Consider what went into that curriculum: history, geography, literature, enough mathematics to read a wage slip, basic science, civics. Notice what did not go in: how compound interest works across decades, how to read a balance sheet, the difference between an asset and a liability, what a trust structure is, how tax law can be engineered to protect capital, how ownership of property generates income without labor. None of that made the curriculum, and it still largely hasn't. This was not an oversight. The incentive to leave it out was structural. Act 3, the hidden mechanism. Here is how the system operates at the level beneath the surface. The public school system produces 2 outputs. First, it produces workers. People trained to trade their time for a wage, follow hierarchical instruction, and identify their financial ceiling as the salary attached to their occupation. Second, it produces consumers, people who receive that wage and spend it, cycling money back through the economy in predictable, tax-legible patterns. Both outputs are useful to those who own productive assets. Workers provide labor. Consumers provide revenue. Neither output requires financial literacy to function. In fact, financial literacy in the worker-consumer population would complicate the system considerably. A population that understood compound interest would save more and borrow less. A population that understood ownership structures would demand equity rather than wages. A population that understood tax law would shelter income rather than pay it automatically. So the knowledge remained concentrated. Research shows that financial habits begin forming as early as age 5. Yet financial literacy instruction in elementary and middle school remains inconsistent across nearly every state in the country. Think about what that means. By the time a child receives any financial instruction at all, if they receive it, they have already spent a decade forming habits. And emotional relationships with money shaped entirely by their household, their neighborhood, and the advertising ecosystem around them. Wealthy households pass down financial knowledge informally. At the dinner table, in conversations about portfolio allocation and trust structures and tax planning, non-wealthy households pass down financial anxiety, avoidance, and wage dependency. Both groups then enter the same school system. The school system teaches them the same things, which means the gap that existed at entry grows at exit. That is the mechanism. It is not dramatic. It is structural, and it has been running for over a century. Act 4, the Vanderbilt and Rockefeller autopsy. Now let us examine the most instructive case study in American financial history. 2 families, built in the same era. One family's fortune evaporated within 2 generations. The other's has survived and compounded across 6, the Vanderbilts and the Rockefellers. Cornelius Vanderbilt accumulated $100 million in family wealth by the 1800s, equivalent to roughly $3 billion in today's dollars, but proportionally far larger relative to the economy of the time. When he died in 1877, his personal fortune exceeded what the U.S. Treasury was holding at that moment. By any measurement, one of the most successful wealth builders in human history. And yet, within 30 years of his death, no Vanderbilt was among the richest people in the country. Within 50 years, the fortune was essentially gone. The autopsy finding is precise. The family never developed a strategy to preserve their wealth. The Vanderbilt fortune was lost because they failed to pass down financial education and management skills between generations. Cornelius excelled as a businessman but could not teach financial wisdom to his descendants. The absence of sufficient planning was the final nail in the coffin. The family did not participate in estate planning. Asset management became fragmented. Large assets were lost to taxes and legal challenges. The family's failure to establish trusts or legal bodies to secure their wealth destroyed a once massive fortune. This was not fraud, not theft, not catastrophe. The absence of transmitted structural knowledge. The exact same absence the public school system guarantees for the general population. Now look at what the Rockefellers did differently. What started with oil and industry evolved into a systematic trust-based blueprint that enabled the Rockefeller family to preserve wealth across 6 to 7 generations. 6 to 7 generations. The Rockefeller family formalized the concept of the family office, establishing an entity solely dedicated to managing their wealth, investments, and philanthropic efforts. They founded the first official U.S. single-family office in 1882. They developed long-term strategies focused on private equity, real estate, and structured philanthropy. The Rockefeller model set the standard for family offices, demonstrating the benefits of structured long-term wealth management beyond traditional banking. A family office is essentially a private institution, a dedicated organization whose sole purpose is the management, protection, and multi-generational growth of a single family's wealth. It employs accountants, lawyers, investment managers, and tax strategists, not as outside services occasionally consulted, but as a permanent internal operation. John D. Rockefeller used family trusts, in addition to charitable trusts, to secure and manage wealth for his heirs. Family trusts operate by transferring assets to a legal body separate from the individual's estate. This division safeguards assets against creditors and judicial judgments, ensuring wealth is preserved for recipients. When structured properly, a trust fund can grow for decades or even centuries while providing distributions to beneficiaries. The key being that distribution rates are set low enough that assets continue growing faster than they are withdrawn. Let that sink in. The trust grows faster than it is withdrawn from. That is not a savings account. That is a perpetual wealth engine, a legal structure that compounds capital across generations while simultaneously providing income, shielding assets from taxation, and concentrating decision-making authority in trained hands. The Vanderbilts knew how to make money. The Rockefellers knew how to keep it. That distinction between wealth creation and wealth preservation is the entire subject of the financial education that wealthy families pass to their children privately, while the public system teaches the children of workers how to calculate a percentage tip. ACT 5, the statistics that confirm the pattern. This is not a story about unusually reckless heirs or unusual market conditions. It is a universal pattern confirmed by data. A 20-year study of 3,200 families found that 70% of wealthy families lose their wealth by the second generation, and 90% lose it by the third. 70%, 90%. There's an old Chinese proverb, rice paddy to rice paddy in 3 generations. The Japanese say kimono to kimono. The English say clogs to clogs. Every industrialized culture across every continent has independently arrived at the same observation. Wealth, without knowledge of how to preserve it, returns to zero within 3 generations. This pattern exists across radically different tax systems, different inheritance laws, different capital markets. It is not a tax problem. It is not a market problem. It is a knowledge problem. And the knowledge problem follows class lines with extraordinary precision. A 2022 survey showed that 88% of adults believe their state should require a personal finance course for high school students, near total public consensus that this knowledge should be taught. And yet, graduation requirements for financial literacy are still being phased in. California and Pennsylvania, 2 of the 3 largest economies in the United States, will not require a single personal finance course for high school graduation until 2030. This is the structural reality. 88% public demand. 170 years of delay. The system moves fast when it serves the system's original purpose. It moves very slowly when it doesn't. Act 6. What the wealthy actually know. Let us now examine precisely the content of what is not being taught. The first principle, the difference between earning and owning. The public school system is built around the concept of earning. You develop a skill, you sell that skill to an employer, you receive a wage. Your financial ceiling is the labor market value of your skill set. The wealthy understand that earnings are a starting point, not a destination. The mechanism of wealth is ownership of assets that generate income independent of your labor, real estate that collects rent, businesses that generate profit, equity positions that appreciate, capital deployed in interest-bearing instruments. Every dollar of earned income has a ceiling determined by hours in the day. Every dollar of owned income has no ceiling. It compounds while you sleep. The second principle, debt is a tool, not a condition. The working class relationship with debt is almost universally one of suffering. Credit card balances compounding against them, consumer loans, financing depreciating assets, mortgages extracting wealth through interest over 30-year periods. The wealthy relationship with debt is categorically different. The wealthy borrow to acquire productive assets, commercial reals, estate, businesses, equity stakes, assets that generate returns exceeding the cost of the debt. They use leverage not as a symptom of financial stress, but as a deliberate amplification mechanism for capital already in motion. This distinction between debt that extracts wealth and debt that generates it is not taught in schools. It is passed down in conversations between wealthy parents and their children, in private family offices, in rooms most people never enter. The third principle, tax law, is not a fixed constraint. It is a negotiable architecture. Most people experience taxation as a fixed deduction from their paycheck. They have no relationship with tax law because their relationship with income is simple. Wages flow in, taxes flow out automatically, the remainder is theirs. The wealthy understand that tax law is a system of incentives, deferments, shelters, and structures that can be navigated by those EA with the knowledge and legal infrastructure to do so. Estate planning represents the ultimate expression of this, ensuring that carefully built assets pass efficiently to the next generation rather than being consumed by taxes and legal fees. The Vanderbilts did not fail because they were not wealthy enough. They failed because they had no architecture. The fourth principle, time is not your enemy. It is your instrument if capital is deployed correctly. A dollar invested at 7% annual return becomes 7.61 in 30 years. In 60 years, it becomes 57.86. In 90 years, $440. In 120 years, over $3,300. The Rockefeller model is, at its core, a compounding engine. Capital placed inside legal structures that protect it from taxation and fragmentation, allowed to grow at market rates across generations. Not spent, not consumed, not divided. Compounded. The wealthy don't invest for retirement. They invest for dynasties. The public school system teaches students to save for emergencies. The wealthy teach their children to build structures that compound across centuries. These are not the same lesson. They are not even the same category of thinking. Act 7. Who benefited? Who paid the price? The system produces reliable outcomes. The families who built the industrial economy also built the educational system that trained the workforce of that economy. They positioned themselves at the ownership layer, the layer that receives returns from capital deployed across an entire system. while the system they funded trained everyone else to operate at the labor layer. This is not a crime. There is no villain in a pinstripe suit in this story. There is no secret meeting where industrialists decided explicitly to keep the public financially illiterate. What there is incentive alignment. The people who shaped the educational curriculum had every structural incentive to produce workers and consumers. They had no structural incentive to produce capital allocators. Capital allocators would compete with them for the same assets. Financially educated workers would demand equity rather than wages. A sophisticated consumer population would negotiate better terms on every financial product they purchased. The incentives pointed one way, the curriculum followed. Elite reformers believed the system would help maintain social hierarchies while integrating immigrants into an industrial society. Schools became tools of cultural control and homogenization rather than incubators of individual financial capability. Who pays the price? The data is not ambiguous. The debt that burdens workers is the interest income that enriches capital holders. The taxes that automatically deduct from wages fund public systems that the wealthy navigate around through legal structures. The financial anxiety that keeps workers focused on their next paycheck ensures that the ownership layer remains largely unchallenged. This is the structure, and structures are very difficult to dismantle because they serve too many interests simultaneously, and most of those interests have far more political and economic power than those who bear the cost. Acta 8, the irreversible constraint. Here is where we must be precise. There are only 3 ways the system changes. The first is private initiative. Individuals who, through access to information outside the public school system, acquire the structural financial knowledge that was withheld and use it to build wealth across generations. This happens, but it requires extraordinary self-directed effort against significant informational barriers, and it does not change the system. It only allows some individuals to escape its outcomes. The second is policy reform. This is moving slowly, but even when it arrives, it is constrained. Because financial literacy education as currently designed typically covers personal budgeting and savings accounts, it does not cover trust structures, tax arbitrage, private equity, family offices, or multi-generational capital strategy. The gap between what is being proposed and what the wealthy already know remains structural even if the reforms succeed. The third path is the continuation of the status quo, wealthy families passing down private financial knowledge across generations, while the public system continues producing workers and consumers, and the gap between those who know and those who don't compounds across decades like interest on unpaid debt. None of these paths is fast. None of them is painless. The knowledge gap is not self-correcting. It compounds in the same direction as capital. The longer it persists, the wider it becomes. The wider it becomes, the harder it is to close. Because those with the most capacity to fund its closure have the least structural incentive to do so. That's the trap. Act 9, why it matters now. An estimated $84 trillion will change hands between now and 2045. This is what analysts call the Great Wealth Transfer, the largest intergenerational transfer of capital in recorded history. Generation X is expected to inherit close to $30 trillion. Millennials, more than $27 trillion. $84 trillion is about to move, and it is moving through a population that was structurally undertaught about how money works, how capital compounds, how wealth is preserved, and how legal structures protect what markets alone cannot. The outcome is predictable. Research tracking 100,000 families found that 70% lose inherited wealth by the second generation and 90% by the third. The Vanderbilt story was not exceptional. It was representative. Most of that $84 trillion will not survive to a third generation. Some of it will. The portion that survives will belong to families who either already possess the private knowledge the school system never provided, or who acquire it deliberately before the transfer occurs. The gap between those two groups is not luck. It is not intelligence. It is not virtue. It is access to a specific category of knowledge that has been systematically withheld from the public curriculum for more than a century by the same institutional forces that benefited most from its absence. Every generation, the same outcome. Wealth concentrates at the top of the knowledge distribution. Anxiety concentrates at the bottom. The Vanderbilts didn't fail because they lacked money. They failed because they lacked the knowledge to keep it. The school system was never going to teach them that. It was designed for something else entirely. The industrialization that justified that design is over. The model remains. The question now is simple. Whether you become the generation in your lineage where the pattern finally changes, not through luck, but through deliberate acquisition of knowledge that was never handed to you, the structure is already in motion.